Harriet Otto had grown accustomed to the relaxed rhythms of retirement in Aspenwood. The little mountain town was a place where simple pleasures, like the smell of pine needles on a crisp morning and the crackling glow of the fireplace at night, made her heart swell with contentment. She had spent 35 years teaching chemistry at the local high school, nurturing her students' curiosity about the wonders of the natural world. Now, in the quiet hours of retirement, she found new joys in gardening, crocheting, and chatting with neighbors about the latest local gossip at Rose's coffee shop. Yet, despite all this serenity, Harriet's inquisitive spirit would not let her rest for long. On a cool September afternoon, she decided to sort through the dusty boxes in her attic. She was searching mostly for old photos, perhaps a forgotten keepsake or two that she could frame for her mantel. Among stacks of lesson plans and faded postcards, she stumbled upon a heavy, leather-bound logbook. Its brown cover bore a faint scrawl, Aspenwood Experimental Trials, 1969. Harriet's curiosity sparked immediately. Why would there be a research log like this among her personal things? Despite the familiar hush of her attic, she felt a strange weight settle in the air. She settled into an old rocking chair, drifting motes of dust swirling in a sunbeam as she opened the log. The handwriting was tall and elegant, and at first glance it seemed like any other scientific record lists of names, procedures, and results. But as she began reading, a knot formed in her stomach. The entries mentioned local residents as test subjects. Tests involving an experimental formula that had never been sanctioned by the usual channels. Harriet turned the pages with trembling fingers, scanning complicated chemical equations. The data pointed to a single conclusion. Someone had conducted illegal experiments on townspeople decades ago. Though Harriet had never heard of any large-scale health scare in Aspenwood's history, she felt certain there had to be something more to it. The log contained references to behavioral changes, mood alterations, and, in one chilling entry, long-term psychological side effects. The year 1969 was more than 50 years past, and any official records would be hard to come by now. Sheila Dunbar, the town librarian, might be the best resource to learn more. Harriet made a mental note to visit her first thing in the morning. After a restless night, Harriet rose early and set off to the library. The structure was a classic building made of honey-coloured brick, with tall windows and a cupola that overlooked Main Street. Sheila, a petite woman with grey hair pinned in a neat bun, greeted Harriet warmly as usual. They exchanged pleasantries, comments about the crisp weather, speculation on the upcoming harvest festival, until Harriet produced the logbook. Sheila's kind eyes widened at the sight of it. She set down her mug of tea, gently trailing her fingers over the worn leather cover. It appeared to spark her memory. "I recall some rumors," Sheila said softly, lowering her voice so it wouldn't carry through the quiet library. "Nothing concrete, but there was talk of a mysterious lab that once operated on the outskirts of town. People said they were testing new pesticides, or at least that's what they claimed. A few folks complained of strange illnesses. Then, suddenly, the lab was gone, and nobody wanted to discuss it further." She shrugged, her face tinged with worry. Old secrets have a way of staying buried in places like Aspenwood. Encouraged by this snippet of information, Harriet asked if she could look up old newspaper archives. Sheila led her down a narrow corridor lined with dusty shelves, flipping on overhead lights that buzzed softly. She pointed Harriet to the archival section, vintage newspapers going back a century. Harriet spent hours combing through the pages, focusing on the late 1960s. She found agricultural announcements, local tragedies, advertisements for newly constructed homes, but it took a close read to spot something strange. Scattered mentions of odd events near the town's outskirts. One editorial piece insinuated that an unnamed laboratory was involved in questionable studies. No official name was mentioned, but Harriet's heart pounded as she thought of the logbook upstairs on the reading table. Determined to piece together more of the puzzle, Harriet spent the next few days reaching out to long-time residents of Aspenwood, people who might recall events from 1969. Many were reluctant to talk, shrugging off her questions with half-answers, or claiming they had been too young at the time. Yet a common thread emerged. Everyone who remembered hearing about the lab also remembered a hush that fell over the town. People who asked too many questions were labeled troublemakers. The lab officials, rumored to be corporate outsiders, vanished overnight. A sense of relief seemed to flow through Aspenwood after their departure, as if the townspeople preferred ignorance to facing what truly occurred there. The deeper Harriet delved, the more troubled she became. She spent her evenings hunched over the logbook, cross-referencing names with the old phone books she'd discovered at the library, trying to match them to any living resident or their descendants. Each name told a story. There was Bill Carter, a father of two, who had complained of severe migraines in the log. Next, Harriet read about a teacher, Margaret Fields, who had experienced erratic mood swings. As Harriet continued, she realized something startling. Some of these individuals had quietly left town soon after the experiments. Others seemed to have stayed but retreated into private lives, rarely engaging with the community. One chilly morning, Harriet decided to track down Bill Carter's son, Michael. She found him by chance while strolling through Main Street to where he was tending to the potted flowers outside his hardware store. Michael was in his mid-50s, with a kind face weathered by time. When Harriet mentioned that she was once his high school chemistry teacher, Michael beamed with recognition. After some polite chit-chat, she broached the subject. Michael's face clouded over with uncertainty. "My dad barely spoke about his migraines," Michael told her in a hushed tone as they stood near a display of rakes and shovels. "I know they hit him around the late 60s. He went to see specialists, but none of them could figure out why he got them so suddenly. Eventually they stopped, but it changed him. He became withdrawn. I didn't realize anything unusual happened during that time, just that Dad preferred not to talk about it." Michael rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "If there was some experiment involved, I never heard that part, but I did hear about a local lab that closed without much warning." While their conversation was enlightening, Harriet still felt as though she was tiptoeing around a truth that no one fully grasped, or that some might prefer remain hidden. She left Michael's hardware store with a stiff sense of resolve. She resolved to find whoever had signed the lab documents in the logbook. There had to be a scientist, or possibly a local figure, who oversaw the entire operation. After scanning the log again, she identified a single name that appeared repeatedly: C. Radcliffe. She didn't recall anyone with that surname from her years in Aspenwood, so she resolved to do more digging. That evening, Harriet laid out her notes on the kitchen table, the logbook open to the page with the signature. Next to it she placed the old phone directory, missing pieces marvelously replaced by the library's microfiche. Running her finger down each line, she tried to locate a Radcliffe. Nothing. Frustrated but not surprised, Harriet decided to check other possibilities. Perhaps Radcliffe was an alias. Or maybe Radcliffe had never officially lived in Aspenwood. She relied on the one tool she seldom used, the internet. Typing C. Radcliffe plus 1969 plus researcher into the search bar felt like flinging a message into the ether. But Harriet's knack for tenacity had taught her that sometimes small threads lead to big discoveries. Much to her surprise, a clipped newspaper snippet from a scientific journal appeared. It dated back to 1970 and mentioned a Dr. Constance Radcliffe who had abruptly ended a series of field studies in Colorado. The snippet was too brief to provide much more detail, but it gave Harriet new hope. She dug deeper. An old obituary listed to Dr. Constance Radcliffe as deceased in 1988, rumored to have left behind a niece. Perhaps she would learn the final piece of the puzzle. Harriet jotted down the name, Diane Radcliffe, who supposedly lived in a neighbouring town called Greenvale. Early the next morning, she gassed up her dusty sedan and made the hour-long drive to Greenvale. It was a smaller community than Aspenwood, with a tight cluster of shops and a life that revolved around a shallow lake. Harriet found the local library, another small brick building that smelled of must and old wood. After inquiring with the librarian about any record of a Diane Radcliffe, Harriet was directed to the local phone listings. There it was, a single entry of D. Radcliffe, living on Lakeview Drive. Harriet wasted no time. The house stood at the end of a gravel driveway, partially enveloped by tall oaks. Harriet approached with a twinge of nerves. She rang the bell, and after a moment, a woman in her late 40s opened the door. Diane's cautious smile suggested she wasn't used to unexpected visitors. Harriet introduced herself politely, mentioning that she was researching her aunt's scientific studies from decades ago. Diane's eyes flickered with something between curiosity and wariness, but she gestured Harriet inside. Over cups of tea in Diane's cozy living room, Harriet explained the significance of the old logbook, recounting the hush-hush experiments that took place in Aspenwood. Diane listened attentively, occasionally interjecting with bits of family lore. She confessed she had little contact with her aunt, who was considered a family oddball. But she did recall hearing about a corporate sponsor for her aunt's research. It might have been a company called Pintree Innovations or something along those lines, Diane said, brow furrowed in thought. The name rang no immediate bells for Harriet, though it fit Aspenwood's general timber-themed identity. Despite her limited knowledge, Diane offered Harriet a small box of her aunt's papers. "I found them in the attic after my parents died," she told Harriet, shrugging. "I never threw them out, but I also never bothered to read them. Maybe you'll find the clues you need." Harriet expressed her heartfelt thanks, feeling an odd mixture of relief and dread. She spent another half-hour reviewing the basic background of Dr. Constance Radcliffe, who, according to Diane, was very bright, but often described as thoroughly single-minded. The conversation ended amicably, leaving Harriet grateful for the new lead. Returning home, Harriet carefully examined the box's contents. Most were letters written in a hurried script, full of references to efficacy trials and potential sociological impact. Her pulse raced whenever she saw references that seemed to confirm the experiments had been done on live subjects, without full disclosure, a serious breach of scientific ethics. Among these letters, Harriet found a thin file stamped with confidential. It contained correspondences between Dr. Radcliffe and an unlisted address in Aspenwood. The letters hinted at cover-ups, forging records, paying hush money, and evacuation schedules. Harriet realized with a twist in her stomach that the experiment was never meant to be disclosed publicly. Feeling both outraged and protective of her town, Harriet wondered what harm might still be lurking. She needed to confirm whether the formula had lasting effects on participants. Was there still a hidden supply of the substance somewhere? As Harriet dug deeper, she discovered references to a secondary location in Aspenwood, an abandoned barn near Willow Creek, referred to in the letters as a storage facility. She recognized Willow Creek Park from her daily walks, where a winding path led toward a rarely traveled dirt road. It might be the perfect spot for a secret stash. The next day, Harriet donned her walking shoes and a warm jacket, gathering her courage. She began her stroll toward Willow Creek Park, following a narrow footpath around the bend. True to the letter's hints, a dilapidated barn stood just off the road, partially obscured by overgrown brush. The ancient wooden planks looked ready to collapse in a stiff wind. But Harriet approached carefully, pushing aside tangles of weeds. A rusted padlock blocked the door. Harriet eyed it dubiously, then rummaged in her bag for a small tool set she kept for emergencies. With some persistence and a bit of luck, she pried the lock open and stepped inside. The interior was musty, lit only by slivers of sunlight punching through the gaps in the walls. Old crates and broken equipment littered the area. Harriet coughed against the dust as she searched for anything resembling a hidden stash. Her heart pounded when she spotted a large wooden chest pushed against the far corner. The chest was locked, but the years had rotted the hinge so severely that Harriet managed to lift the lid with some effort. Inside, she found glass vials, labeled with chemical abbreviations. They were sealed in protective foam, along with typed notes that read, "Test Batch 47 for local distribution." Harriet felt a cold shiver trickle down her spine. The shock was immense. Vials of an experimental serum sat in a dusty barn, presumably forgotten for more than half a century. What if the containers had leaked into the ground? Or worse, what if they were stable and someone was still using them? Even though Harriet considered disposing of them right then and there, she realized that might destroy evidence crucial to discovering whether there were any lingering effects. She carefully placed a few vials into a padded bag, intending to hand them over to authorities for proper handling. But as she turned to leave, a beam of light caught something on the barn wall. A faded symbol that matched the corporate logo described in Dr. Radcliffe's letters, Pine Tree Innovations. Taking a steadying breath, Harriet secured the barn door behind her, replaced the rusty lock as best she could, and headed straight to Sheriff Ben Thompson's office. The sheriff, a thoughtful man with a salt and pepper beard, listened carefully to her account, examining the logbook and the vials she presented. Although Harriet caught a flicker of skepticism in his eyes at first, his expression soon shifted to concern. "This is serious," Sheriff Thompson said finally. "If these vials are what you claim, we'll need to handle them with caution. We also need to investigate who else might know about them." Harriet felt the tension drain from her shoulders. She wasn't in this alone. The sheriff assured her he would send a team to manage the remaining vials and examine the barn. Word spread through Aspenwood in the days that followed, though many townspeople shrugged off the revelations as old news. Some were rattled, however, especially those who remembered family members with unexplained ailments in the late 60s. Local experts arrived to test the vials, and preliminary reports indicated the formula had psychoactive properties that could induce prolonged mood changes, even hallucinations. Harriet was horrified to think that unsuspecting individuals in her beloved hometown had been unwitting test subjects for a corporation seeking to perfect a new product, perhaps for military use or for some other nefarious dealings. Amid the unfolding drama, Harriet was hailed as a quiet hero for her persistence in unveiling the truth. The town council invited her to a meeting where scientists shared their findings. They explained that although the formula was potent, the half-century that had passed meant most effects had likely dissipated over time. They also confirmed that the batch in the barn had fortunately remained sealed, preventing environmental damage. Harriet's relief was palpable, but the thought of what could have happened left her uneasy. The council debated what actions to take, finally deciding that a public statement should be released detailing the discovery, along with assurances that health screenings would be made available to any concerned individuals. In the weeks that followed, families talked about the revelations over dinner, dusting off old memories of relatives who had insisted something was wrong all those decades ago. Former students of Harriet's reached out, both surprised and proud that their one-time teacher was at the heart of the investigation. Yet Aspenwood, in its characteristic cozy way, seemed to absorb this bit of dark history and channel it into neighborly alarm rather than hysteria. Folks gathered for potlucks and knit circles to discuss the incident, hoping to offer comfort to any who still felt unsettled. Of course, with every major discovery came more questions. Families of those named in the log wondered if bigger health issues might emerge. While local doctors reassured them there was no immediate concern, Harriet sensed a collective unease lingered just beneath the surface. She, too, found her thoughts drifting back to Dr. Radcliffe's motivations. Had she been coerced by Pine Tree Innovations, or was she a true believer in her own research? The question ate at Harriet. even as she accepted that she might never know the whole truth. In the end, Aspenwood settled back into its everyday quiet. The swirling rumours and excitement began to die down. To Harriet's relief, the official verdict from both local authorities and environmental inspectors was that the formula posed no current threat. In typical small-town fashion, the final resolution felt more like a gentle exhale than a dramatic climax. Mississippi Street's residents gathered in Rose's coffee shop, sipping their cappuccinos and sharing hushed commentary on the secret experiments. A new storyline in Aspenwood's tapestry had emerged, weaving together the darker threads of secrets with the bright threads of neighborly care. Though Harriet yearned for a satisfying moral coda like an apology from the ghost of Dr. Radcliffe or a confession from Pine Tree Innovations, she recognized that life seldom provided such perfect endings. The best she could do, the best anyone could do, was learn from the past. She made one final trip that autumn afternoon, placing a single red rose on the doorstep of the abandoned barn before stepping away. It felt symbolic, a small tribute to those who unknowingly served as subjects, and a promise to remain vigilant in protecting the town she loved. By the time the harsh winter winds began to swirl around Aspenwood, Harriet moved on to other projects. She helped organize a fundraiser for the senior center, tutored a few struggling science students, and even took on daily walks with her cat, Galileo, in tow. Yet, a piece of her heart remained anchored to the leather-bound logbook stored safely at the sheriff's department. She would forever be that teacher with a relentless passion for unveiling scientific truths, no matter how buried they might be. And while Aspenwood's old secrets might have faded from the top of people's minds, the knowledge of what had taken place lingered. In the hush of the library stacks, in the folds of old newspapers, it remained. Harriet stayed vigilant, her sharp mind always ready to notice if something was amiss. She had learned a valuable lesson. The quiet corners and dusty attics of a small town can hide extraordinary mysteries. All it takes is a curious spirit and a deep-rooted love for one's community to bring them to light.